Thank you so much to everyone who's kind of been participating in our series, our Freelancer Masterclass series. Today, we're going to talk about the strategy to price your freelancing services. This is the 4th installment of an 8-part series. So if you've kind of missed the previous episodes, just ping us at the end of this call, and we're happy to kind of send you the link to our YouTube video. We have a recording of all of our content. So these are the things that we'll talk about today. So quite straightforward, but we do have to kind of go quite in depth in a couple of these topics. So please bear with me. There's a couple of sections that where I nerded out a little bit, and there's a little bit more detail in terms of numbers and mathematics, but I hope you bear with me. So we'll talk a little bit about how you value your time, and then we'll talk some strategies on how you can price your freelancer services. And again, just a reminder, we want to make this as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt me anytime you want. And also, there's no such thing as a stupid question. If you thought about it, I'm sure that a lot of people have thought about it as well. So just interrupt me anytime, and happy to answer your question on the call. Okay, so again, a quick introduction of me, since I see that there's a couple of new people on the call. So my name is Ricky. I am the co-founder of Ravenry. We are building a business around freelancers. We're helping freelancers basically grow their business and make their business more sustainable by providing them with relevant resources and software to scale their business. My background, I've been in freelancing for about 5 years. So I've started as a consultant, and in the past 5 years managed to kind of build an annual recurring business around consulting that is 6-digit in terms of income. So what I'm passionate about is in helping people, especially freelancers, kind of like do the things they love and turn it into something that is financially sustainable for them. So that is why we're doing this Freelancer Masterclass program, because I just hope that I can share a little bit about what I've learned across the years, and hopefully can benefit other people through that. So a recap on our on the last episodes that we've done. So the last 2 episodes, we talked about, the kind of some strategies you can actually use to package your services. So we talk about how you don't want to be jack of all trades. We talk about, building a niche around your capabilities. And we also talk a little bit about how when you're packaging your offerings, you want to try to stay as much away as possible from the doing and focus more on the outcome. So if you've missed that episode, again, feel free to ping us at the end of this call, and we're happy to send you the link. And then from last week, we talked a little bit about how we can kind of have a bit more focus around targeting the right customer segments for our business. So the approach that we've proposed is to come up with a quick hypothesis in terms of the kind of customers that we want to target, figure out how to define their persona from the perspective of their behavior, demographic, psychographic, etc. And then figuring out ways to test your assumptions really, really quickly, and test your approach to getting those customers really, really quickly, and iterate as you go. So we talk a bit about those things in the past 2 episodes. And today we'll talk a bit about the next step, which is now that you are able to package or define the offerings that you want to offer as a freelancer, you are already testing your strategy on getting new customers. We talk a bit about how you can price your services at this point. So let's begin. So to begin with, when it comes to pricing, I think a lot of people, they have the tendency to just jump straight into, figuring out, okay, like how much do I charge my client, right? But what I would propose, and this is kind of what I did as well when I started my freelance business, is to start with an income goal that I have in mind, right? And before we do that, it's very important for us to be aware of the kind of services we are offering as a freelancer. So to me, there are 4 different categories of freelance services. This is kind of like a breakdown based on the kind of activities you do as a freelancer, right? So the first one is an operator. So this is someone who exchange the time, right, for money, right? So this could be this is typically someone who's doing, very manual labor, or very kind of like basic task level, jobs or projects. Like someone who's doing like virtual assistant role, someone who's doing, an hourly data entry job. So those are the kind of people that I would categorize under operator. Their focus is really just doing and following the instructions that is given by the client, right? The second layer, or the second type of of freelancers, is called what I call creator. these are people who are exchanging their skills for money, right? So these are people who create things, and they can be designer, they can be, a freelance writer. So these are people who's kind of like, honed a specific expertise or skill set that they can then now exchange, for, in the freelancing world as offer that as a service and kind of like make money from those skills that they have. The third category of service provider, I consider them thinker. So these are people who exchange their knowledge for money, right? So this can be someone who is like a PM, a project manager who knows how to kind of like manage a specific project or solve a specific problem. This can be a consultant who is experienced in figuring out how to set up an agile team or build an agile training program for a company, right? So these are people who have specific knowledge that they are now able to kind of exchange for money, right? The final group is what I call advisors. So these are people who are usually they have very specific skills, and those skills are something that they hone and they build through the years, by doing a lot of projects, by working for different organizations. And right now they are able to kind of advise companies or advise their clients using their experience. So I would usually consider someone in this category as someone who is who has a lot of experience, who is an expert in very specific industry or very specific domain. And most of the time they take on the role of an advisor. So it could be an advisor to a CEO. They could still be a consultant as well. Someone who actually build new startups for large companies. Someone who can come into a company and becoming like a CTO or CEO or CIO for hire. Those kind of role, I would consider them as an advisor because they're exchanging experience for money, right? So depending on what kind of service you offer as a freelancer, you will have a very different income goal, right? So someone who is who's got like 20, 30 years experience will probably have a significantly higher income goal than someone who is kind of like, doing virtual assistants as a service, right? So again, like understanding where you play in this segment will really help you determine the right income bracket that you should target. I should also mention at this point in time that just because you're in one type of work category doesn't mean that you cannot straddle across the different segments that I've mentioned here. So for instance, if let's say you are a writer, right, you can easily operate in the role of an operator, creator, and thinker, right? So a writer could be someone who just is supposed to produce an article for SEO purposes. So maybe the quality, the depth of the research is not as important. And there are also writers who are writing for journalistic purposes, right? So it's something that should be published, friendly. It should be something that is, very well researched, very well written. So that is someone who is probably more under the creator segment. And it could even be someone who's under the thinker category, who is someone who probably will help the clients come up with content strategy, think about how, they can, build multiple, content pillar that they can then scale, and they can even help the client manage, their content team altogether, right? So again, just because you are in one work category doesn't mean that you cannot straddle or do work as an operator, creator, or thinker, or even advisor, right? So I just want to highlight that before we move forward. So when you think about your service offering, right, it's not enough to just think about, oh, I'm a writer, and therefore, I can compare myself with someone with 20 years experience writing. No, it's not. It's very important for you to understand clearly the kind of value you offer to your client. Are you just a writer? Are you problem solving for them? Are you doing the research as well? Are you helping them manage a team? Are you helping them brainstorming new topics, new campaign strategy, etc., right? So again, depending on that value that you bring, you might be operating at a different level, and therefore your income goal might be slightly different. So again, when you're thinking about how much you want to price your service, it's very important that you want to think about your earning target or target earning for the year, right? Typically, I think a lot of people think when they think about their the value that they bring and the price that they want to charge a client, they think about it from an hourly perspective. And oftentimes what they do is that they think about billable hours perspective, right? So does everyone know what billable hours are, or should I explain a little bit more about that? Just give me a thumbs up in the reaction if you understand billable hours. Otherwise, I'll spend a bit more time. Okay, so Arika understands it. Okay. Okay, so, okay, if you don't understand it, probably this is a better question. If you don't understand it, give me a thumbs up. Okay, Adi doesn't understand it. Okay, there's quite a lot of people who doesn't understand it. Okay, let me try to explain that. So billable hours are basically the time that you spend directly contributing to the client's project, right? So let's say if you are a designer, right, your billable hours is, for example, like you spend 3 hours creating the design and doing the, I don't know what designers do, to be honest. They create a concept, they send to the client, and then the client say, okay, I want to do this color, can you edit this way? And then they do all of that, right? So the exact amount of time they spend on the design itself is called billable hours, right? Now, as a freelancer, you actually spend a lot of time doing other activities for your business that is not billable to the client, right? So for example, as a designer, you probably will spend a lot of time setting up your, I don't know, your software, right? Or you'll probably spend a lot of time doing administrative work for your client. For example, like just exchanging emails with them, or, reading their revision notes, or creating a proposal. So all of those things are non-billable hours, right? Because clients won't be happy if you bill them those hours. So when we're thinking about your potential income for the year, it's not sufficient to think about your time from a billable hours perspective only. It is really important for you to think about your time cumulatively that you spend in the business, right? And I'll explain to you as I go, like why that is important. But I think first things first is for you to kind of understand when you think about your earning potential and the amount of time you spend trying to kind of like get to that earning potential, you need to think about the holistic effort that you put into actually generating those income, right? So that is billable plus non-billable hours, okay? And once you've kind of come up with a number, and today I won't spend too much time, probably won't be productive for me to kind of like tell you, okay, James, you probably should be aiming this income. Darren, you should probably be aiming at that income. It probably won't be the best use of my time and your time. You probably know what the market rate is, or you probably know how much you want to earn more than I do, right? So I would suggest that you go back and kind of have a thought, have a think about like, so what's your kind of like income target for 2022, for instance, and just jot it down and kind of like have that number in mind as we kind of like go through this exercises or this workshop. Once you've kind of like done that exercise, once you've come up with a number, right, it is very important for you to do a quick common sense check or fact check with the market, right? So I think the reason for this is because we want to have a realistic target in terms of our income, especially if you're just starting out as a freelancer. A couple of suggestions for me to kind of like, for you to kind of like look into in terms of like, strategies to fact check with the market. Look at, freelancer marketplaces like Upwork, Fiverr, freelancer.com. I do not recommend this, but this is the easiest way you can compare, like what is, the basically like, what's the market charging for the kind of work that you do. But that is kind of like an easy way to do it. So I recommend that you start there and just take a look at like what other people in similar situation who actually are offering, similar services with similar amount of experiences are charging their clients. That's one. The second one that I probably think will be more relevant is to kind of like just look at Glassdoor, or job board platforms, right, where they posted full-time roles, and they explicitly share with you how much a company is willing to pay for someone who is like a full-time something, right, a full-time freelance, a full-time writer, a full-time designer, etc. And that is probably a more realistic way to peg your income or your target, because that is basically what the market is paying and what the market is valuing your services at. Having said that, again, this varies very broadly depending on your experience level, and depending on your credibility as well. So if you've got like a lot of amazing projects, you've done a lot of work for big logo clients, you might be able to command a premium to the market. But as a starting point, if you're just starting today, it's good for you to just kind of like have a realistic expectations in terms of your income goal, and have that kind of like in mind as an anchor, rather than trying to kind of like, pull a number from thin air and unrealistically trying to kind of like target those numbers and feel disappointed at the end of the year if you don't achieve it, right? So do some fact checking as you are coming up with your target income as well. And the next thing that I would do as a freelancer, if I were to kind of like, think about the kind of like my pricing strategy, is that I need to figure out my hourly rate. And there's a few reasons why I want to do that. It's not because you want to charge your client this rate, right? It's because you want to kind of understand at what rate would you not want to do work, right? Now, the challenge that I see with a lot of freelancers, and I do have a few freelancer friends as well. I live in Singapore, so I do have a few freelancer friends based in Singapore, is that they don't actually have an internal like rate that they are working with, right? So in their head, they don't know how much like they want to value their time, right? And the issue with that is that you start to take on projects that may not necessarily be, reflective of the value that you put on yourself. So let's say if I think that my hourly rate is $400 per hour, right? And let's say I look at a project, and when I kind of do the math, I realize that, oh, like it's gonna, boil down to about, $200 per hour, right? That's how much that the client is willing to pay me, right? It's much easier for me to say no to those projects rather than, trying to kind of guess whether or not that project is worth my time, right? And in the end, agree to doing project that is not going to pay me what I think I'm worth, right? So it's very important to set an hourly rate, define this hourly rate upfront, and use that as an internal mechanism for you to define or determine whether or not you will take on a project. I think this is like one of the most important things you should do as a freelancer so that you don't undervalue yourself in the long run, right? The other reason why you want to do this is because it makes it much easier for you to be able to do a mental math in your head whenever a client comes to you with some sort of requirements or request, for you to kind of be able to understand how much you want to charge this client, right? And the reason why that is important is because you want to qualify most of your clients before you start producing a proposal for them. So in my experience, again, like I'm a freelance consultant, so the kind of projects that I get from time to time is very broad. Like clients come to me with all sorts of projects. Most of them are not very well defined. And it's very difficult to kind of like, look at the project or hear about the project up front and be able to throw a number and see if it's worth my time or not, right? But, if I have my hourly rate, kind of like, built into my thinking mechanism or mental model as a freelancer, it's much easier for me to say that, okay, like based on like what I hear from this client, it seems like, they will require about 60 hours of my time, to produce the kind of output that they expect. And knowing this company, I don't think they can pay the rate that I expect to get paid, right? So based on that, I can very quickly, not waste my time and focus on, the clients or the proposals that is, that I think from clients that is able to pay me, rather than kind of like spending time on projects that may not necessarily be the most valuable use of my time, right? So these are the reasons why I think it's very important for us to have an idea of what is our target income and work backwards to kind of like get that hourly rate that we operate on internally, right, in our head, and be able to help us qualify the right projects for us to do, right? And just to again emphasize, the hourly rate that I'm talking about right now is not the same as the price that you're charging your client. Okay, they are two different things. It's just a very quick, peg or very quick, I guess, benchmark that you have in your head when you're thinking about like different projects that is coming your way, so that you can quickly make a decision whether or not something is worth your time or not, right? And it's very important to kind of have that readily available. So how do you come up with your hourly rate? So this is where I'll nerd out a little bit more, okay? So a lot of freelancers mistake when they think about their income is that they look at the overall project fee as their income. Now that's not true, right? So if you look at the first line on the top, right, there's a formula, which is your target income should be your project fees, which is how much you charge your client, right? So if you look at the second line, project fees is billable hours multiplied by hourly rate, right? So that is your project fees. So your income is your project fees minus the cost, right? And cost, if you look at the third line, it includes things like non-billable hours, incidental costs, and overhead, right? And I've defined like in the bottom three lines what those are. So non-billable hours can be things like sales activities, you doing operational stuff, right? Like setting up your software, or, I don't know, even like, making sure that you are picking up new skills to, learn how to solve a specific client's problems based on their requests, right? Or it could be administrative activities like invoicing, doing your accounting, etc. Incidentals are costs related to provision of your service, right? So this could be, spending time purchasing stock images, travel expenses that you've made because you are doing like, maybe qualitative research project where you have to travel to different cities and interview different customers, right? So that could be incidental costs that you should build into your cost. And finally, your overhead, right? So as a freelancer, we all have a fixed cost that we're operating on. This could be, you kind of like getting a co-working space in, in an office, right? You have to pay a monthly rent. you as a designer, you might have access to, I don't know, like Figma, or might have access to Adobe, right? And you need to pay subscription for that. Like clients won't pay for that, right? So it's kind of like your fixed cost that you have to take into account. And it could be salaries as well, or even contractor costs. So let's say you outsource certain activities or certain things to, someone else to do, right? It could be someone else doing your taxes, or it could be someone else who help you do copywriting. If you are a writer, let's say, you need someone to kind of help you with editing, you might kind of like outsource some of that work to an editor. So those should be part of your overhead, right? And when you think about your income, right, you need to think about all of this cost that is kind of like part of your activities, and make sure that that is not built into your income target, right? So when you think about your target income, it should be your project fees taking out your costs, right? So minus your costs. So that will be the amount of money that you'll make at the end of the year, right? After you've kind of like paid the bills, after you paid all the incidentals, etc. So it's very important for you to kind of like know that distinction up front, right? So whatever you make on, Fiverr, freelancer.com, those like, top line numbers, right, are not exactly the things that the exact amount of money that's going to go into your pocket, because you have to kind of like pay out some of these costs as well. So take into account those costs. So based on this formula, therefore your hourly rate, right, as you're kind of like, going through this exercise of planning and thinking about your internal cost or internal price, is it should be your target income plus your cost divided by your target billable hours, right? Now, it might be a bit difficult for you to think about, what's your target billable hours at this point in time, because again, if you're starting out, you might not have a clear idea of how many days in a year you can actually, do projects or get paid for your time, right? But I would suggest that you do some sort of estimation, right? So for me, in my business, typically billable hours versus non-billable hours is about, I would say about a 30 or 40 to 60 ratio. So 40% of my time are billable. The rest is probably not billable, right? Which means that I spend 60% of my time doing sales, doing marketing, doing operational stuff, learning new things, using new tools, building my website, etc. And 40% of my time I will be working on a client project, right? So I would estimate that like my billable hour will be 40% of the available hours I have in a year as a freelancer, right? And then I will take my total income for the year plus the total cost that I estimate I will spend, right, as a freelancer for the year, divided by that 40% of my hours in a year that is billable, right? And that should give me an hourly rate. And as you kind of go through this exercise, I assure you, you will realize that your hourly rate is going to be much higher than what you have been charging or what you think you should charge your client so far in your freelancing life, right? And that is the first realization that you have to make as a freelancer, is that you need to kind of build in all these costs. Otherwise, you will never make like the money that you are targeting as a freelancer and make it into a sustainable business for you, right? So hopefully, as you're going through this exercise, you will discover this hourly rate to be higher than what you think it is, and that will kind of help you understand a bit more about the value that you bring to your client as a freelancer. Okay, enough about your internal pricing or internal hourly rate. Let's talk about like the meat of this. Let's get to the meat of this workshop, which is what are some of the pricing strategies that's available to me as a freelancer. Okay, so to me, there are actually three main ways to go about thinking about your pricing when you look at a client, when you talk to a client, right? The simplest one, okay, this is in order of like easy to difficult, okay? Market-based pricing is the easiest way to think about pricing. Second is cost-based pricing. And then finally, value-based pricing. Okay, I'll go through it one by one. So market-based pricing is simple, right? Your price is essentially the market price plus some sort of a variance, right? So what is a market price? So market price is whatever your competitors in the market that's offering exact same services as you are charging. And then what you do is that you add some sort of variance to it. Variance as in whether you want to charge more or charge less, you vary it depending on your client, depending on whether you think your capabilities are the same as your competitors. You vary it based on whether or not your offerings, right, in terms of the service, in terms of the value that you bring are similar to your competitors, right? So this is the easiest way to do it, because you can see what's available in the market, right? Like again, through things like Upwork, through things like Fiverr, you can see what people are charging, and you can charge people based on that, and then you can vary it to get more competitive, right? Now, so what's great about market-based pricing? Okay, so first is that it helps you be very competitive from a pricing perspective, right? So customers, especially marketplace, right, they will they have a tendency to look at, your track record in terms of how many projects you've done. And then the second thing they look at is probably your pricing. So how much are you charging compared to the next person on the list of the in the marketplace, right? So the next best alternative there that is being offered by Upwork or freelancer.com, right? So if you're able to kind of charge based on the market, you have that price competitiveness built into your offering, right? And that usually can help you get the client much more quickly. Second thing is, it's great for starters. So if you're just starting out and you don't have a strong portfolio and you don't know how much you should be charging, you don't even know how much cost you will incur as a freelancer in offering your service, it's good to just kind of look at what other people are doing and just charge based on what the market rate is, right? And you don't have to spend too much time thinking about this. The third thing that's great is that you're basically like price anchoring, right? So you're anchoring your price to what's kind of like in the market already. So your customers won't be shocked. Whatever you're offering is already kind of like the norm in the market. So you don't have to spend too much time, convincing your customers that, you are worth the money, because when they look at, the market, they look at other competitors, other alternatives, they are charging about the same amount of time, amount of money, right? So you don't have to worry too much about figuring out how to differentiate yourself. So that's the great thing about market-based pricing. There's a lot of not so great things about this. So personally for me, this is my least favorite strategy, right? Because first, you're basically playing the price war game, right? So when it comes to market-based pricing, you are not trying to differentiate yourself too much. And the only thing that is going to differentiate you from the next person is how much you're charging, right? So it's not really a great way, because everyone will just keep lowering their price and figuring out a way to kind of like make the offering cheaper to get their first client. And as a result, the entire market will just, the value of the service that you offer in the market will just go lower and lower and lower. And overall, it's not great for the freelancer economy, right? Because you don't have pricing power, which is not good. Second is that once you've kind of like, gone into this game and you've kind of like started with your first client with a market-based pricing, it's really hard for you to kind of like raise your prices in the future, right? So let's say you thought that, okay, my strategy is that I want to get my first client first. After they are, impressed by how much work I've done and how great my work is, I want to increase my price. It's really difficult to do that, especially if your product is, or your service is homogeneous, because then they are just going to keep comparing you with other players in the market, right? And if you're pegging your price based on the market, then it's very difficult for you to explain to your customer why you want to increase your price. Okay, not great. Finally, it just shows that you're not differentiated. If you're charging, the same amount of money as the next person, it shows to the client that whatever service you're offering is just the same as the next person, right? And that is a problem. Even though in reality you might be a better freelancer, you might offer better service, you might offer better output, right? But because your pricing is exactly the same, customers just don't feel like you are that, you're not offering like a premium service, right? So it's the same as like if you're looking at a bag, like a luxury bag, and they are selling their service or their product at the market rate, right? Even though yes, maybe like the product is very similar, right? But the value that they bring, in terms of a luxury brand is very, very different, right? So once they start charging like, the market rate, they are not able to extract that value from the customer, and that perception of value about their brand and about their product suddenly drops. So it's not great. So again, it's not something that I am a big fan of if I were a freelancer, but it's great if you're just starting out and, you want to just get your first few customers in. So when should you consider this, right? So first, as I mentioned so many times, if you're new to market, this is a great strategy to start your freelancing business, right? Just start by offering something very competitive. And, again, when you're starting, you don't really have a lot of edge. So price could be one of them, and you want to take advantage of that. Two, do this when the scope of work is very, very defined, right? So what do I mean by this? So when you are working with a client, right, oftentimes, many times actually, right, like clients don't necessarily know exactly like what they want. And therefore, when they engage you for a service, they will think that they want A, but the reality is that they want A plus B, right? And if you are charging your client on a market-based basis, right, or a market rate basis, it's very difficult for you to offer that, additional service, because you don't have a lot of room to navigate, right, in terms of your pricing, because you're charging based on what the market is charging as well. So it's not great if the kind of projects that you're taking on is not very well defined. So make sure that if you're doing this, you define the scope of your offering very, very clear. If you're a writer, for example, make sure that the number of words is there, the outline of the content is there, the number of revisions, all of that should be defined upfront. Otherwise, it'll be very difficult for you to make a profit out of that project. The third reason, or the third situation where you want to use this strategy, is if your service is not differentiated. So again, as I've mentioned, if your service is the same as the next person, right, then the only thing you can do is probably to offer something that is a little cheaper, right? So again, if you're starting out, again, great way to do it. Fourth, this is a little bit advanced, I guess, but if you have a scale advantage, it is a great way to kind of like use market-based pricing to basically eliminate the competitor and stand out, right? So what I mean by this is, if you find a way to build a freelancing offering that you can scale to so many people, right, with very small marginal costs for every single customer that you get, right, and therefore your cost base on an average basis is very low, you should try to win the game of pricing, right? Using kind of like, this strategy. Because by definition, if you have scale, your cost per service or cost per customer will go down significantly, and you are able to kind of like undercut a lot of your competitors in the market by offering the same service at significantly lower prices. But that only works if you have scale economy, right? And scale economy, by that what I mean is that you have a way to significantly reduce your overhead costs. You have a way to significantly reduce your variable costs, which is the cost it takes, or the labor, in this case for freelancers, the labor it takes to produce a certain output for a customer, right? So if you have a way to significantly reduce that, then this could be a good strategy for you. The fifth one is that if you're in a marketplace. So unfortunately, if you're in Upwork, if you're in Fiverr, if you're in freelancer.com, people are going to compare you with fellow freelance designer, fellow freelance writer, right? So once you're kind of in that position, there's a very little room for you to wiggle in terms of differentiating. So once you're in a marketplace situation, you might want to try to compete based on prices as well. Again, because you are competing with 10,000 other people who's offering probably very similar things to you, right? So it's very difficult to differentiate in that situation, and you want to try to kind of differentiate this way. So how do you use market-based pricing to advantage, right? So I think I mentioned this a little bit. So there is a weak position. So on the left, I consider it as a weak position. On the right, I consider it as a power position, right? So if you're able, so let's start from the right, the power position. If you're able to standardize your offering, right? By that, what I mean is that you can offer packages of services that is very, very well defined in terms of scope, right? It'll put you in a position of power, right? Same thing as what I mentioned before. If you're able to figure out a way to scale your operation, right? Overhead, administration, delivery of service, any variable costs related to delivering that service, then you have a power position as well. The third thing is that if you're able to tap into global market arbitrage, right? What I mean by that is, taking advantage of the socioeconomic differences between different markets, and offer a service to, let's say, like you're based in Southeast Asia, you can offer your service to European market at a significantly lower cost. Then you have arbitrage opportunity there by still making significantly a lot of money compared to the average freelancer here in Southeast Asia, but charging significantly less compared to the local freelancers in Europe, right? And that will allow you to have a position of power by using market-based pricing, right? So this is one strategy that you can use if you want to kind of play in that game, right? So figure out how to standardize your offering, right? Figure out how to standardize or scale your operation, or find what market arbitrage they are globally and tap into those as a way to win in the market. A weak positioning is that if you are using market-based pricing and still offer a broad range of service to your client, right, it will put you at significant disadvantage, because most of the time when you offer a broad range of service, it's very difficult for you to scale. The customer touch point becomes much higher, because once you offer 20 different things to a customer, they'll jump on a call with you. You need to figure out how to troubleshoot this for them. They'll have different requests for this and that. It becomes significantly more difficult for you to try to kind of use market-based pricing as a strategy for you to stand out in the market. The second one is, if you don't have any standardized processes to, and that is scalable, it's also really difficult for you to kind of use market-based pricing to position yourself in the market. And that will put you at a significant disadvantage, because what will happen is that you will charge at market rate, but your cost will be significantly higher than your competitors, right? And therefore, you will not make significant earnings or income at the end of the day, right? So you don't want to be in that position as well. So the next one that I want to talk about is cost-based pricing. I think if you Google it, if you look around, like, some people call it the cost plus. So the mathematics for this is quite simple. The pricing that you offer your client is basically just your cost of delivering that service, right? So billable, non-billable, incidentals, right? Plus margin, which is how much money you want to take home at the end of the day, right? Pretty straightforward. As a freelancer, you define what your margin is. Again, as I mentioned earlier today, you should already have an idea what your hourly rate is. Typically, I will use that if I were kind of like using this cost-based pricing strategy. I will use that hourly rate as a way to kind of determine my margin, because then I will make sure that I will actually make that target income at the end of the year, right? So this is a strategy that you can use as well. So what's so great about cost-based pricing? One, it's very easy to determine your margin, right? You should know your cost, you should do your math, right? And it's something that should be within your control, right? If there's anything within your business that's within your control, it should be your cost. You should know what software you use. You should know, where you are, paying rents, and, where you're paying for your lease. Let's say if you're getting an office, you should know, like, what kind of incidentals you will incur in providing certain services. So those are things that is within your control, and you can actually determine your pricing because you should know your cost, and therefore you should know your margin, and you can actually set the right price based on that. So it's very easy to kind of start with. The second thing that's great about cost-based pricing is that it is great for projects with no clear deliverables, right? So if, let's say, your client do not know what is the end output, right? Maybe you're doing a consulting project, that doesn't have a very clear deliverable because the project is on a rolling basis, right? Or maybe you're doing a branding campaign for someone, and again, it's on an ongoing basis, so there's no clear output, or there's multiple outputs that could change every single time, right? It might work quite well with cost-based pricing. Similarly, if the project that you are working on doesn't have a clear ROI, which means that it's very hard for you as a freelancer to determine the value that you're creating for your client, it's much easier for you to generate your price based on cost, because then it's just much easier for you to justify, like why you're pricing your service this way, right? So that's something that you want to consider. What's not so great about cost-based pricing is that there's just very little buffer for cost creep, right? So again, think about it this way. If you're charging clients based on cost, that means that you have to stick to your cost as strictly as possible, right? Because any variance, any changes, right, will result in you eating into your margin, right? So it's very difficult to kind of like, manage that for some projects. So again, like depending on what projects you're working on, you might want to consider this as well. For projects that has, a very unclear, cost structure, or very unclear cost components, you might not want to kind of like use cost-based pricing in your proposal. One thing that is not great as well is that you're not accounting for demand requirements, right? What I'm saying is that clients might actually get a lot more value than what you're proposing in terms of price, right? So you might actually, and this is kind of related to the third point, you might actually leave quite a lot of money on the table because you don't consider the kind of value that you generate for your customers, and therefore you're not charging at that value level. But there are still situations where this is great, right? So first is that if it's very difficult for you to determine the output of your engagement of your project, right? It's a very useful way to kind of like, use cost-based pricing in your strategy, right? The second one is, if your capital outlay for your service provision is really, really high, it's great to use cost-based pricing, because you can use that as an excuse to tell a client that I need to charge this much because I'm going to spend so much money, trying to kind of like get all this done. So an example of that is, for example, Ravenry, we do research, right? So one of the most expensive things about research is the database, right? So we have to kind of have a subscription to different databases. The second thing that might be very expensive, depending on the project, is the process of recruiting panelists to respond to our survey, or to kind of like join an interview, to interview expert and stuff like that, right? So those things are really, really expensive. Now, if as a business, I know that these are things that are really, really expensive, and clients do know that as well, it's very easy for me to use that as an excuse to tell the client that, oh, I'm going to charge you this much because the things that you ask me to do will require ABC, which is going to cost me a bomb, right? So that is a very easy way for you to kind of like, justify your price. So if you are in a business or you're building a freelance business that requires significant capital expenditure or cost expenditure, this is a great way to justify your pricing. And this is a great way to kind of like strategize how much you want to price in the market. The third reason why you might want to use this strategy is that you have a cost advantage in the market. So again, this is all leveraging on the cost arbitrage that I mentioned earlier. So if you have, an advantage in a specific market with regards to some resources that is significantly cheaper compared to your competitors, you might want to use cost-based pricing as a way to beat your competitors in the market, right? So again, that's a strategy you can think about depending on your business. So where do you use it, and when do you get the advantage, right? So let's start with power position, right? So if you have like a cost advantage, right, maybe through proprietary processes or you have access to low-cost resource, that will put you in a power position, right, when you're competing with your competitors in the market. If you have information arbitrage, so if the customers do not know how much cost you'll actually incur, right, in your projects, right? So this is a bit of the opposite of capital advantage or capital outlay advantage I talked about a little bit earlier, right? This is where the industry or the work is a bit more opaque, right? It's much easier for you to kind of like, charge based on cost, and you can use it as an excuse to tell your client that, look, like it's very difficult to, find this kind of person to interview. And therefore, like we have to charge you this amount because, it'll take us X amount of hours, plus we'll have to pay this person, like $2,000 to kind of do the interview with us, right? So that information arbitrage will again help you price higher, in terms of your service. The third thing that I've mentioned earlier is capital advantage, right? So if you're a business that requires like a lot of capital as part of the service delivery, then you can use that as an excuse to charge more to your client, right? So the example I've used earlier, which is, okay, you have, maybe you are in a business that requires a big fixed cost a component to be able to kind of deliver your service. It could be like, for example, in research, we need to have, subscription to like different databases and different data points, right? So those can be an excuse for us to kind of go to the client and say, look, like if you want to get this kind of insights about this market, then you have to pay us this much because we are subscribed to Bloomberg, which is costing us like $20,000 a month or something like that, right? Then that will help you charge more for your services as well. Now, the weak position, right? So if you actually have no control over your cost component, then you'll be in a weaker position if you use this strategy, because the challenge is that you are exposed to the volatility or the unknown, cost components that might come in as you deliver the project, right? So imagine this. Let's say you assume that your cost is going to be $10,000, right? And that's why you charge your client $20,000, okay? And you're making like $10,000 margin. But if your business, if you do not have a very strong control over your cost component, that $10,000 cost could easily fluctuate to like $15,000, $17,000, right? So once you do not, if you do not have component over the cost component, sorry, if you don't have control over your cost component, you'll be in a much weaker position if you kind of use this strategy to charge your client. The second one is that if your service is very easily substituted, right? So again, if there's a lot of people out there that is kind of offering similar services as you in the market, then it's going to be very difficult for you to stand out, and it's going to put you in a very weak position because everyone can just come in and say that, look, like I'm just going to charge you. This is like the price I'm going to offer. Cost plus margin is much lower than you, right? And you're not going to be, in a strong position to argue with your client about pricing in the future, right? So again, something to consider as well as you're thinking about your pricing strategy. The final one, and this is the most difficult one to execute or to pull off, is what we call value-based pricing, right? So this is where the value, the price that you charge your client is based on the value that you generate for them, right? So price equals to buyer ROI. So what are the kind of values that you can consider? So in general, there are two main categories of value that you can generate to a client, right? One is if you help them improve their top line or results, right? This could be revenue, this could be traffic, this could be the number of customers, increase the speed of delivery of their service, etc., right? So anything that helps us generate more money as a business is, falls under this category of improving results, right? And you can actually estimate a lot of this, again, based on what you do, and using that as a strategy to basically charge your client, right? The alternative is to look at the amount of savings that you're helping generate for the client, right? So again, as a freelancer, what I've listed here is just kind of like from a business perspective, what the service itself will offer. But working with a freelancer does have a lot of savings advantage for clients generally. One is it shortens like recruitment processes. It doesn't require the client to comply to any full-time employee regulation. So sometimes they have to provide benefits, they have to provide, superannuation, they have to provide healthcare, etc. Right? So those things are not usually built into our costs or our fees, right? Which actually makes freelancers a much more appealing option to clients, right? We are basically much cheaper, right? And also we can start working much more quickly because oftentimes you're more experienced in what we do. We know exactly, what is required, and we are a lot more flexible than, if the client were to hire someone else full-time, because they will have notice period, they have onboarding process, etc., etc. So that's like a long process for them. So as a freelancer, oftentimes we can also generate value just by, having that flexibility working with a client. But at the same time, we can actually help them save things like, the amount of man hours they will spend, if they were to use an alternative service, right? If let's say they work with an agency, right? The margin that they're making, right? They can actually save by actually working with freelancers instead, right? We actually have significantly lower operations costs because again, we don't actually have a big fixed cost. So oftentimes, again, a fee that we charge our clients are significantly lower, right? So these are the things that you can use as a way to estimate the value that you generate to your client, right? So then how do you quantify? The next question is, how do you quantify this value and help like your customers understand, what you're bringing to the table, right? So if let's say your role, you're a freelance writer, right? One thing you can do is potentially look at how your work is going to help them bring more traffic. Let's say if you're a writer, right? You are writing a blog article or you're building a thought leadership report for your client. You can think about how the kind of work that you do will bring them additional eyeballs to their business, to bring additional traffic to their business. And you can estimate, right? And I'm sure the clients will have some detail about this. For example, conversion from blog, reader to like, sign up as a paid client, right? I'm sure they have some sort of a conversion number. You can ask them about it. And you can estimate the value that you'll generate from producing high quality work for them, right? And that will be the value, right, that you peg your price against, okay? So again, let's use a concrete example. Let's say you're a writer, right? And you're writing for this company, and you know that, in your past experience, doing a 3-month project with, 20 articles will, using your expertise as, a writer, you're able to help generate 5 times more traffic, right? So let's say for the customer, 5 times more traffic is 10,000 more people, okay, coming to their website. And the customers also know that their conversion rate from, visitors to becoming like a paid client is, let's say, 5%, right? So out of 10,000 people, right, you'll get 5% of that, which is 500 people, right, who will actually sign up and become their customers, right? And you probably will know as well how much these paid plans are, right? So 500 people, let's say their annual subscription for their software, right, in their business is, let's say, $100, right? So 500 people will generate $50,000 for them from like those 3 months worth of work that you generate for them, right? And using that, you can actually price your service, right? So if you tell the client that, look, like based on my experience, in 3 months, I can help you generate like, 4x more traffic, and that translates to about $50,000 more revenue for you. I want to justify, my service to be about, 20% of that, because it's fair, right? If I actually, produce these articles and actually bring you traffic, I should be rewarded according to the value that I bring your business. So that is kind of like one way you can justify the value and therefore the price that you want to charge your client for the work that you provide. Now, what is the great thing about this approach, right? First is you earn what you're really worth, right? So this forces you to work for the output rather than work for the hour, right? So you have to be really smart about it. You have to kind of like, really, you have to be really results focused. But what happens is that you are actually getting the upside of the engagement, right? So you're not capped by like the number of hours you spend writing. Instead, you're capped by the amount of value you're generating for the customer, right? Which is really good. The second thing is that it's a great way for you to kind of like drive real results for clients and generate that client happiness, right? So the clients will keep coming back to you. And finally, it's a great way to build credibility, right? So once you've kind of like been able to establish yourself as someone who's able to generate this kind of results for clients, other clients will follow suit and like work with you, right? So it's a really great way to build high quality premium services if you're a freelancer in the market. So what's difficult about this, right? One is something that is really difficult to resource, because sometimes it's, you don't start from, if you're kind of focused on the result that you want to generate for your client, it might be very difficult for you to estimate how much time you might want to spend to help them get that result, right? So it's something that might be very difficult, especially if you're a beginner, to resource for that. So an example for that is, I'm working on a consulting engagement right now, like my company. And we have a project that is quite big, right? But the whole point of the project is to help the company generate 5 new startups, okay? Now, I know what it takes in terms of process to actually help this company build or come up with these 5 new ideas and therefore turn it into 5 new startups. But what I don't know is that how much time will each of these startup require from my team, right? Because if let's say they come up with like, something that requires AI, it will require me to find an AI expert. If it's someone who require like big data, then I need to find big data expert, right? So as someone who is a consultant upfront, right, now at this stage of creating a proposal, it's very difficult for me to figure out like what kind of resources I will need, right? So that buffer for resources needs to be really big. And therefore, when you're thinking about value-based pricing, you need to have a really wide berth or big margin in case the resources or the cost component vary significantly during the course of delivering that project, right? So it's very important to think about that. The second thing is that sales cycle is usually really long for these kind of projects. So the reason for that is because you want to explain to the customer why you are charging so much, or why you are pricing yourself this way, right? And the reason why it's also longer, the sales cycle, is because you need time to come up with a good proposal, estimating what kind of value you'll generate for them, right? So oftentimes this sales cycle becomes significantly longer. The third thing is, it's really difficult to start by using value-based pricing as a freelancer, unless you're a well-known person or expert in your industry, right? Because you need to have a lot of credibility to be able to kind of convince customers that you are able to generate that value for them. So these are the things that you might want to consider as well as you're kind of thinking about your pricing strategy. When should you consider this? One is, if you have a unique value proposition and you can generate that kind of value for the customer, it's a great way again to kind of like price your service, because there's not a lot of substitute out there in the market, right? So that's kind of like my second point. It's very difficult to find an alternative to you as a freelancer, right? So you can actually charge and command a premium in the market, right? Whereas if you think about like cost based pricing or value or market based pricing, and you're a unique person, right? You're not able to kind of command that kind of rate, right? So if you are a unique individual with unique expertise, and your service is very difficult for other people to replicate, it's a great way for you to kind of price your business or for your offering, right? The third thing is, your project value needs to be high, right? Because again, as I mentioned earlier, if your project value is low, it's just not worth that time that you spend trying to convince a client to use your service, right? So let's say if you can only, that like, the client is only able to pay $2,000, right? But then the sales cycle, will take like 3 months. And, across 3 months, it will take you like, 4 hours per month writing proposal and reviewing with the client, jumping on a call. That's already 12 hours invested, right, into generating or trying to win a $2,000 proposal, right? So it's not worth it if your project value is low, right? Only focus on it if the project value is high, or if the client is trying to kind of work with you long term, then it's worthwhile to kind of like consider this approach. The fourth one, and this is the most important, is that the output of your work needs to be highly leveraged. What I mean by that is that the amount of work that you produce, right? You may not spend a lot of time in producing the deliverables, right? But because of your expertise, because of your knowledge, because of your experience doing this for a long time, that the 5 hours that you spend doing this will generate something like a 50x of like what an average person would generate, right? If they were in your position doing that project, right? Which means that 4 hours of your time will generate 50 times. That's 200 hours worth of value to the customer, right? So only if you're able to kind of like do that should you use this value-based pricing, because otherwise it's very hard for you to kind of like prove to the client that you're actually generating real value, right? So make sure that the kind of work that you do has high leverage. Otherwise, it's very hard for you to command premium pricing with this methodology. So power position. So you'll be in power position if you have unique capabilities, okay? If you have cornered expertise, which means that you have something very unique in terms of expertise and capability So let me just distinguish this, because I think it gets a bit confusing. Unique capabilities could be something like, oh, we have like a proprietary process. Okay, we have a proprietary team, and I have like a proprietary software that can like enhance my ability to deliver that service. So that's capabilities, right? Cornered expertise is like, okay, I'm an expert in oil and gas, writing in Indonesia, and no one else knows oil and gas as much as I do, because I've been in this industry for a long time. I know who to interview. I know all the government people, right? So that's cornered expertise. You have the expertise that no one else has and no one else can replicate, right? The other power position is that if the entirety of your service offering is greater than some of its parts, okay? So what I mean by that is, if let's say you are a writer again, right? For you to provide an end-to-end service, helping the client come up with a concept of like the writing, the article, all the way to doing the research, all the way to writing it, editing it, and doing the design, right? That is a lot more valuable. If you can kind of like, offer that as a service, right? That could be a lot more valuable than if the client can actually get someone to do the editing, someone to do the research, someone to do the writing, right? Or the editing, right? And it's very important that the whole is greater than some of its parts, because the value, again, that leverage that you're generating is in the synergies between those parts, right? And only if you as a freelancer can generate that, should you try to kind of like use this value-based pricing, because that will really help you put yourself in a power position that a lot of other competitors cannot copy and cannot substitute, right? So the alternative, or the other side of the extreme, is that if you're in a weak position, right, that is because the small, the project value that you're bidding for, that you're trying to win over, they're really small, right? So it's not really worth your time to try to like spend significant amount of time estimating the value that you generate to the client and going through that long sales cycle. The second thing is that if you cannot demonstrate the ROI clearly to the client, right, it doesn't have to be tangible or measurable, but it needs to be demonstrable, right? So it needs to show the client, oh, like I managed to kind of like, help you grow the business. Oh, I managed to kind of like create three new ideas, 3 new startups. That is more important than like, being able to just measure like the detail, right? If you can, that's great, but you don't have to, but it needs to be demonstrable. If it's not, then it's very difficult for you to use value-based pricing, because your customer at the end of the day will ask you, so what is the result? And you can't articulate it at all, and you can't show it. And that will again like make you look really bad, and you'll lose credibility over that. So again, think about that as well as you're kind of thinking about what pricing strategy you want to use. I know we are at the top of the hour, so I'll try to wrap this up really quickly. We do have next week to talk about negotiation and proposal, so I'll cover this bit as well next week, don't worry. But there's this other component that you need to think about as well as you are kind of like thinking about your prices, right? So pricing is one thing, right? Packaging your service plus the pricing is another thing, right? So as you're thinking about like how much you want to charge your client and what pricing strategy you want to use, you need to consider these 5 things. One is the kind of work that you do. What is the scope, right? Is your work typically time sensitive, right? Is your work customized or standardized, right? So that means, am I producing just like logos and it's a standard process, or do I have to like, sit down with a client, interview them, and understand like what their branding DNA, what their company DNA is, and therefore come up with a branding strategy that is aligned with their DNA, right? So that is a customized service. Fourth is the frequency of the service, right? So if the client requires you to come back again and again and again and again for the same thing, right, that is high frequency. If the clients come back to you with like 1 project a year, but it's a big project, that's low frequency, right? Finally, touch point. Does the client require you to talk to them every day or every week or every month, right? So depending on how often that client connection or client interaction is, you might want to think about the right way to package your service, right? And figure out the right strategy to price it as well. Now, we talk about value-based pricing, market-based pricing, and cost-based pricing, right? But what you need to do next from there is not just charge your client based on value, right? But you also need to think about like, what is the framework through which you want to price your service, right? So in the freelance world, these are the things that come to my mind, when I think about, packaging a service. One is if you charge based on project, hourly, daily, weekly, credit-based. So credit-based means the client pre-buy certain credits. So let's say they buy like 20 hours of your time, and then they will use it as, they wish. Then fourth is retainer. So it's very similar to credit, but it's kind of like the reverse. Retainer is where the client will pay you regardless whether or not they're using your service, right? But they just want to make sure that you're on standby, right? And they pay you a monthly stipend or whatever, right, to kind of like retain you. So that's a retainer. And for any service that is kind of like done above that threshold of a retainer, you charge them hourly or daily or weekly rate, right? That could be something that you can also think about as you're thinking about how you want to package your service. Fifth one is subscription. So if you're able to productize your offering, right, and standardize the process through which you do this, you can charge your client a monthly rate, and you promise them that, okay, for $200 a month, I will give you one article, and you do that, like, for 12 months, for example. And finally, results-based. So this is again the trickiest. It's very similar. It's like the extreme end of value-based. So results-based is when you tell the client that if I'm able to generate you 20% more revenue at the end of the year, I want 2% of that revenue, for example, right? So that could be something that you can consider as well as an option, right? Yeah. So these are the different ways you can package your services and produce a proposal for your client based on what you're offering them. Just a quick kind of summary of what how you need to think about what's the right way to kind of price. So project based, you want something that is well defined with specific timeline, cost, usually services that require a lot of customization, you want to charge on a project basis, and something that is high touch, okay? Retainer, you want something that is custom offering, someone that, requires your service on an ongoing basis with high touch element, right? Because you want to be able to charge and tell them that, like, okay, if you call me up, that is part of your retainer and I'm going to charge you that hour, right? Subscription is if you have well-defined scope, specific timeline, and recurring need. So again, if you, let's say, offer like graphic design, like I'll produce like one social media post design, every single week. That's a great thing for subscription because it's very well defined, the scope, right? One post, one LinkedIn post, or one like Facebook post, and it looks like this, and it's going to be 2 revisions, and it's going to be done every week, and it's going to be done on a weekly basis, for the next 12 months, right? So that's recurring. So that's great if you can like have that kind of offerings. You can charge subscription based. Results based is if it's kind of like custom offerings and also high touch. Hourly, daily, weekly is custom, recurring, and high touch. And credit based, unfortunately, is if you kind of have a lot of recurring need, but you cannot define the scope, you cannot define the timeline, you cannot you don't know whether it's going to be customized offering or not. It's best to kind of like charge clients on a credit basis. Okay, so I'll talk about this again next week. So we're going to drill down on that a bit more next week as we talk about negotiation strategy and also proposal strategy. But for now, I'll pause here. And I just want to quickly summarize like what we've talked about today. So when you're thinking about pricing, think about these 3 things. Start with your income goal, okay? Price based on market cost value that you generate, and figuring out the right framework to price your offering, right? So these are the 3 things that you need to think about as a freelancer as you go about coming up with your service offerings and trying to price it in the market. I think that's it for today. We again are running a bit behind time. Sorry about that, but thanks for staying till the end. We have another 4 episodes coming up. We are still trying to finalize the schedule because there's a holiday coming up, but do join us and look out for our upcoming events if you're interested in deep diving a lot more into how to become a better freelancer. We also have a community in Telegram and in Discord. If you want to have one-on-one discussion with me or with your peers, fellow freelancers who are serious about their gig and their business, join us, and we'll kind of like try to answer your questions as much as we can and add as much value and share as much resources as we can. We also will be posting all the links on our recordings. The new resources will be producing a guidebook based on our recordings as well. If you're interested in getting all that, join our Telegram and Discord group, and we will be sending that to you